Welcome everybody. I think 3/4 of an hour or an hour might be stretching it a bit. I'll say a few things, make some observations about campaigns and some of the lessons that I think it's important to understand about campaigns, whatever the campaign might be, and then happy to open it up to discussion and questions after that. And thanks again, Harris, for organising this. It's always, I think, not enough people get involved in politics, and the more that people can get involved in politics, the better. Increasingly, people are quite disillusioned. Many people are disillusioned about politics and the political process, but it's an important part of a society's advancement and the way we operate, and it's important that people from all walks of life get involved in it. I've been involved in politics since I was 16, so 40 years ago, and I tried to run for a marginal Labor Party held seat from the Liberal Party in Australia, which is not quite the same as the Liberal Party here. And I turned a marginal Labor seat into a safe Labor seat after campaigning there, which I think says a lot about my campaigning skills in those days at least. And I decided that running for office wasn't for me, but being involved in campaigns was something that I enjoyed. And I think it's an important activity that are not enough people involve themselves in. And some of the things I'm going to talk about today are obviously about the political campaign, but they could just as easily apply to any sort of campaign, whether you're trying to lead an organisation that you're a member of, or you're wanting to get involved in some activity by a council, or whatever it is. The rules of campaigning in many ways can apply to lots of different aspects of life, including being involved in business and the community more generally. And you often hear people, when they're talking about campaigns, talk about or ask questions about, what's the new technique, what's the clever thing that people are doing now that enable you to win? And I suppose the important point I'd make is that there's no silver bullet in politics. There's no particular technique that will guarantee that you'll win the day. And in fact, whilst the mechanics of campaigns are very interesting and important, the most important thing is message. Message matters most. If you don't have a message that's relevant to people, that connects with what matters to them, you can spend millions on advertising, you can spend millions on direct mail and so forth, but it won't strike a chord with people, and so it won't have an effect on them and their lives. So very important to think about what is your message when you're trying to communicate with people, and how do you make that message relevant to the people that you want to communicate with. At its absolute simplest, a campaign is simply finding out who will decide the outcome that you're seeking, an election or whatever it might be, a vote on a development if you're involved in the council, or whatever it might be. Who will decide the outcome? Where are they? What matters to them? And how do you reach them? And how do you monitor the impact of what you're doing when you're communicating with them? You need to constantly review the effect your communications are having. So who is the target for you? Who matters? And what matters to them? Where are they? So you know where to target them, and then how do you get to them? Because different people need to be communicated with in different ways. And I mentioned before I ran for a seat. It was a seat in Adelaide in South Australia, which most of you probably haven't heard of, but much less been to. And it had quite a large Greek and Italian population. And back in those days, most people were first generation Greeks and Italians. So we knew we had to target those communities in particular, but we knew that English wasn't necessarily their principal language. So one of the tools that we used was a personalised letter in Italian or Greek to the various candidates, to the various target audience. It can always go wrong, of course. We won that seat. After I ran, another guy ran. He was much better than me. He won. He won by 35 votes. And his mother, who was Italian, had written a letter to all the Italian people in the community in Italian, urging them to vote for her son. Unfortunately, she put in the letter that her son was already the Member of Parliament and signed it mother of the Member of Parliament. And Labor took it to a court of disputed returns, which is where you appeal against the result, and it got overturned because no one had bothered to check her translation and just let his mum write the letter. But the point is, message matters most, but you've got to engage with your audience in ways that are relevant and connects with them. And basically in a campaign, what you're trying to do is either change or reinforce some perception that people have in order to influence their behaviour. An election is about influencing people's behaviour. To go into a polling booth and put a cross alongside the name of the candidate of their choice. And you have to help them think about what they're doing when they go to vote. Because ultimately, people, I don't think, generally vote on policies per se. They vote for what they think about you and your values and what you think about them, and they vote for what the policies that you take to an election say about what you believe in and what they show about whether you understand people and so forth. But they don't actually vote for a particular policy. And I'll come back to that in a minute because I think that's quite important. And as I'm going along, if any of you don't understand what I'm talking about, by all means, or you want to question it because it's a bit confusing, by all means just ask me on the way through too. I think the other thing, so message matters most, mechanics are only secondary, so whether you use direct mail or the internet or tweet or door knock or whatever, that comes secondary to understanding what is the message you're trying to convey. The other, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to influence people's behaviour by reinforcing or changing a perception. Now, there's really two elements to, in politics, in a political campaign, in influencing people. Essentially, there's a guy called Drew Weston, who's a US Democrat, who wrote a book called The Political Brain, which is quite a good book. I don't know if any of you have read it. And it talks about, it makes a very important point. That is, in politics, when reason and emotion collide, emotion invariably wins. So you can have the most rational arguments in the world, but if you can't connect in an emotional way with people, or your opponents have a more emotional, and I don't mean sort of irrational emotional, but just an emotional edge to them. Then, if your opponents have that, they could well win. And there's a pollster called Richard Worthlin, who was Ronald Reagan's pollster from the time that Reagan ran as governor of California, who our firm originally had an association with. He's passed away. And he always used to say, you persuade through reason, but you motivate through emotion. So you can have a rational policy, you can have a rational position, but unless you can make an emotional connection with people, then you're unlikely to be successful. One of the important elements of a campaign, in fact every campaign is constructed around this basic element, is to understand, I said before, you need to understand who your target is. In any campaign there are really three targets. There's your base, the people that you know you can rely on, who will, either they're innately your supporters or they agree with your philosophical position or the policies that you're advocating and your reasons for advocating them. So there's your base. Then there's the swing group, those people who need to come to you in order that you have the majority that you need to win, but who could go either way. And then there's the anti, your opponents, who you have limited chance of ever persuading to support you. And it's important in a campaign, as you prepare for a campaign, as you're thinking about what you're going to do, to understand who your base is and lock them in first. You need to lock your base in. you've got to have that a base is your foundation, and then the swing is the bricks that go on the top of the foundation. But if you just go hunting for the swing, the people who could change their mind to come to you, and you haven't secured your base, motivated them to turn out and so forth, then you're likely not to be successful. And what you need to try to do with your antis, people who you're never going to persuade, is not try to persuade them. If you run an effective campaign, get into government, are a good government, over time some of your antis will just reduce and they'll move across. But your first priority is not to persuade your antis. Like, as with anything, whether you want to build a house or renovate your kitchen or have a holiday or run an election campaign, you have a limited array of resources available to you. So you don't have the resources to chase every group, you don't have the resources to chase, do lots of things. You've got to steward your resources very carefully. So with limited resources, which you always have, I don't know anyone who's ever run a campaign who hasn't said, oh, I wish I had some more people to help door knock a local community, I wish I had some more money to produce a leaflet, whatever it is. With the limited resources you have, you need to ensure that they are focused on where they will yield most return. So you start by locking in your base, you then move to the swing group and focus your resources on bringing them across. Now in Australia, we have compulsory voting, so everybody has to turn out to vote. And in fact, if you don't vote, you get a letter and you get fined, and if you don't pay the fine, you can go to jail. And we've had about 5 political prisoners in Australia, people who refuse to pay the $50 or $60 fine that it is if you don't vote. So in Australia, it's slightly different. You hear a lot of people talk about, oh, well, if you focus just on your base, that's a core vote strategy. Well, if you focus just on your base, you're never going to win. In Australia, we don't talk in terms of core vote strategies and all that may imply, because we have compulsory voting, which means everybody's turning out to vote. Even people who hate your guts are rolling out to vote. Even people who are completely disinterested in politics are turning up to vote. So in Australia, when you run an election campaign, you have to obviously connect with your base, but you have to connect with all the other voters as well, particularly a big slab in the middle who aren't really supporters of either major party. And in Australia, we have the Liberal Party, which is more like the Conservative Party, and the Labor Party. They're the principal two parties. But everybody's going to vote. And there are some people who hate the Liberal Party and hate the Labor Party. But in the end, you've got to get them to express a view about you relative to the Labor Party, because we also have preferential voting. So whereas in this country you put a cross alongside the person you prefer, in Australia, if there are 5 candidates, you have to give a number for a preference for every candidate. And what that means is that when it comes to the crunch, somebody might vote 1, the Greens, 2, the Democrat Party, 3, an independent, and then it comes down, and none of those 3 parties are going to win. It comes down finally to Labor and the Liberal Party, the Conservatives and the Socialists, basically. And you've got to ensure in your campaign, if nothing else, when it comes to whether they give you 4 or 5, you've connected with them sufficient that they'd rather give you 4 than give the Labor Party 4, and they'd rather give the Labor Party 5 than give you 5. So it's a slightly different campaign challenge in Australia, because we have compulsory voting and we have preferences. But the principle remains. You need to know who is your base, who is your swing, and who is your anti. The other thing, another important lesson of campaigns is that, and sometimes this is attributed to me in the UK media, but it didn't come from me, it came from John Howard, who was Prime Minister of Australia. The statement, you can't fatten a pig on market day. It takes time to build a relationship with voters. You can't just hope, in the final 30 days or 2 weeks or whatever it might be, that you can suddenly make a connection with voters, communicate with them on the issues that matter to them and persuade them. You've got to do the work in advance. And the more preparation you can do on the campaign, the better. because the more you prepare in advance, the more it gives you the flexibility to deal with the problems that emerge during a campaign. You know, when a journalist challenges Ken Livingstone on his tax policy, or has a go at Boris Johnson over a police station closure or something like that. If you haven't done all the basic work well in advance and had that work all locked away, you're trying to do it during the campaign itself, which means you have less flexibility to deal with things that come out of nowhere during the campaign, and they always come out of nowhere during the campaign. You know, there's always the unexpected. So it's very important that you understand you can't fatten the pig on market day. You've got to do as much as possible in advance, and by doing that, you have more flexibility to deal with problems as they arise in a campaign. It's important to have a clear strategy and a written strategy. It's amazing how many times you talk to a candidate, political party, and they say, "Oh yeah, I've got a strategy, it's in my head." It's really important to put down on a piece of paper, on a couple of pages, if you can, what your strategy is, and then make sure that everything you do reinforces that strategy, and you're not easily pulled from pillar to post by whatever the latest media story is, or whatever it may be. And I think one of the other important points I'd make, and I think I said before, message matters most, but the absolutely critical thing is, if in doubt, believe in something. You've got to have a set of values that drive why you want to run for office, or why your party is seeking the people's support. Stand for something. If you don't have an anchor or foundation, some set of beliefs in which you are completely committed, you just flow with the breeze. And I mean, as I said at the outset, you know, people are quite cynical about politics and politicians these days. Whether that's fair or not, that's the reality. So what is important is that what gives people confidence is to know that there's something sort of here and here that is the foundation of what you believe in and what you want to do. So, you know, it's important to believe in things and be prepared to argue for them, even if they're not always popular. As long as you believe them to be important and true, then it's very critical that you stand up for them and you stick to them. And that really segues into polling. You hear a lot about polling. People talk about polling a lot. The media in this country, you know, there's some flaming newspaper's got a poll almost every second day claiming some particular view or another that people have. The way we use polling in a campaign is not to tell us what we should believe or do. You know, if you think that you need a poll to tell you what you believe in, or what you should support, or what you should do, then, you know, in my view, don't get involved in politics. A poll is a navigational tool that helps you understand how you can most effectively communicate to achieve something that you believe in. To give you an example, and sorry I'm using lots of Australian examples, but it happens to be where I'm from, and it's a lot warmer right now, I can tell you. My wife is at the beach with one of our grandsons. It's 32 degrees. It was 32 degrees in the evening when she rang me this morning, and so it's slightly more pleasant down there right now. But in Australia, in 1998, John Howard was the Prime Minister, and one of the things that he wanted to do was to reform the tax system. Now, he firmly believed that Australia was not sufficiently competitive. We're a global nation. You know, the world is interconnected. Australia is a trading nation. It needs to be very competitive in the export market. And our tax system actually penalised exports, making them less competitive, which meant less likely to be sold, meant fewer jobs for Australians because we couldn't compete with other countries as effectively as we should. And also we had a very high rate of tax. The top rate of tax effectively was 50% or higher. And so, and even for people on average income, they'd gone from the lowest rate of tax to the second or third higher rates of tax. So people, the tax system hadn't, the income, I'm talking about income tax, the income tax system had not been modified for many years. And as a result, more and more people were paying tax on their income, and there was an increased reliance on income tax. We were less competitive globally, and he felt that the tax system ought to change. And so he wanted to introduce a goods and services tax, a VAT. Now, when we did focus groups at the time, because I was running his campaigns back then, so we'd have a table like this, a few less people than we've got here, but you'd sit around with a group of swinging or soft voters and talk to them about, you know, John Howard's plans to change the tax system. Guess what? Everybody said they didn't want to pay more tax. No one wanted a new tax. So if you said, oh, John Howard wants to introduce a VAT, who would like that? No one would put their hand up, obviously. Now, if you'd done a poll, if you just relied on a poll that said people don't want a VAT or a GST and left it at that, you'd never have reformed the tax system. He knew that it wasn't necessarily going to be popular, but it was something that he believed to be important to reduce the reliance on income tax, to try to get more people on low and average earnings out of the income tax system, to refocus on consumption and to make our tax system more competitive internationally. And so we used research to help us how to communicate that message. Knowing that he wanted to introduce the goods and services tax, how could we communicate in a way that would lead to people voting for us at the election, even though it wasn't a popular thing to do? And that's how you should use research. You should use research to help you better understand and more effectively communicate, not to tell you what you believe, what you should do. So that's what we use research for in a political campaign. And you know, one thing I'd encourage you all to do is ignore most of the opinion polls you see in the newspapers, because they're so simplistic. All they do is tell you people do like something or don't like something and all of that. And it doesn't mean a lot. And the other thing is to understand what influences people's vote as distinct from what they may agree or disagree with. There are lots of things that people agree or disagree with, but it has no influence on their vote. If you take, I ran Boris Johnson's campaign for Mayor of London last election, and you would have seen that Ken Livingstone focused on transport, bus and train fares, quite a lot during the campaign, cost of the tube and all of that. Now, if you did a poll during that election, you would have found that if you asked people what was the most important issue for them, or the issue they most wanted the mayor to do something about, they would have said bus or train fares, tube fares. The cost of transport was too high. That's what they said was most important to them. But one of the things we do when we do polling is to not just take what people say, whether they like something or don't like something, or what's most important or not important, but understand what actually influences their vote. So any of you who've done economics or mathematics would know that regression is a tool that you can use. It's a mathematical model that you can use to work out what influences or what's most connected to a vote rather than just what people say. And what we found in the mayoral campaign was, yes, it's true that most people said that transport, bus and train fares were the most important thing to them. That's what they said. And you know, it's obvious that was one of the reasons that Ken Livingstone wanted to talk about those issues, that issue, that policy so much, you know, because he promised that he would reduce bus and train fares. And you would have thought that, okay, well, if most voters say that they're concerned about the issue they'd like the mayor to do something most about is bus and train fares, and Ken Livingstone's got a policy to cut fares, well, that must mean they're all going to vote for Ken Livingstone. But in fact, we found that whilst people were concerned about bus and train fares, it did not have a significant influence on actually how they're actually going to vote. Other factors were more important in influencing their vote. One of those factors was trust. Even though Mr. Livingstone had a policy that saying that he was going to cut bus and train fares, people didn't trust him as much as they trusted Boris Johnson. And so, whilst they may have agreed with the policy, they didn't trust him to deliver it. Therefore, it was not as influential in their vote decision as you might have thought. And that's what you use research to do, to understand really what's going on. What are people really thinking and why are they thinking that? And so when we did the campaign, we came to realise very clearly that the thing that was most influential on people's vote, aside from an issue like trust and some personal qualities, was actually who was going to be most effective in growing London's economy. Because people wanted jobs for themselves or their kids, they wanted London to, they wanted a better standard of living and so forth. And they knew ultimately that increased investment in transport comes from economic growth and more taxes paid by a broader population and so forth. So bottom line is, when you do research, you don't do research to parrot back to the voters what they want. When you're a political party, you're doing research to understand what's motivating and driving voters and how you can communicate more effectively, given you believe in certain things already. Now, when you're a lobby group or a community organisation and you're trying to stop something being built or advocate a particular cause, well, often you use a poll to show that 90% of the public want to build a new road here or whatever it is, because you're using that as a point of advocacy. It has less credibility, I think, with politicians, because they're always, there's always somebody who comes along with a poll that says, then somebody else's numbers are always better than your numbers. They'll always come with a poll that shows one thing or another. That's not why a political party does polling. An election is a choice. So it's important when you're running a campaign, trying to get elected, trying to influence something, that you frame that choice. Because if you don't frame the choice, if you don't set the parameters of the choice people are making, then your opponent's more likely to do it. So you need to be very deliberate in the way you define yourself, what you believe in, what you're wanting to achieve, as well as your opponent. What we always try to do is, because people ultimately, they're going in, they're going to look at 2 or more names on a piece of paper, they've got to have a view about the choice of one versus another. And you have to help them think about that choice. And so, we always say to people, define yourself, know what you stand for, set out what you believe in, have a clear set of policies, but also know what you want to say about your opponent and have the evidence to back it up, so that you are not just talking about yourself and defining yourself, but you are defining your opponent as well. And you need a story about yourself. You need a simple story that explains what you're trying to achieve. And as I said at the start, it's got to be relevant to voters. It's got to be in terms they understand and mean something to them. There's a state of Australia called Tasmania. You may have seen on the news recently, because there have been some very bad bushfires down there. It's a small island state, very much like, it's very English. Australians would say it's very English. It's a small island to the south of the Australian mainland. And there was an MP in the local parliament, a bit like the Welsh Assembly, who'd been in the local parliament for quite some years, and had decided that he wanted to run for the national parliament because he's going for the big time. And he didn't win. And before he ran for election, I was in Tasmania, briefing all the candidates, talking to them. And I said to him, so, when you knock on a door, what do you say to people about why you're running, given that you're already a member of parliament in the state parliament? And he said, I say to people that, I've been in the state parliament for many years, and it's a natural career progression for me to now go for the national parliament. Well, you can imagine how enthusiastic people were to advance his career, because that was all about him, about not that I've been in the state parliament for 10 years or 20 years, whatever it was, and I understand actually a lot of the decisions are made in the national parliament. Important decisions that influence your life, like how much tax you pay, or spending on education, and I want to get better schools for our community, fight to keep taxes low, improve the hospitals locally, whatever it is. Nothing like that. So it underscores the importance of having a clear message that is relevant to your audience. It's not about you. And the story about you needs to be positive and differentiating. You know, there's a lot of debate about negative politics and, you know, positive campaigning and attack ads and, you know, how much should a campaign be negative and how much should it be positive. First and foremost, particularly today, my view is more than ever positive campaigning is you should have a much stronger element of positive campaigning than negative. And when you say negative, you really only, what I mean by negative is holding your opponent to account. And you're fully entitled to hold your opponent to account, to focus on their record, focus on what they've done, focus on their promises. Tone is very important when you're executing, well, you shouldn't be executing anybody, when you're executing a negative campaign, tone is very important. It shouldn't be hysterical, it shouldn't be personal, it just needs to be clear and contrasting. But more and more, you need a positive narrative. And certainly candidates should overwhelmingly only ever communicate a positive narrative. Generally what happens in a campaign is you'll have, the candidate will carry the positive messages, talk about what they want to achieve and so forth, and then the campaign itself, maybe the literature that's put out or in what they call in the United States surrogates. In the US, you know, Obama had lots of surrogates who were attacking Mitt Romney all the time about his wealth and decisions he'd made in the past. They should carry the sort of the more negative messages. But overwhelmingly, in my view, the balance should be strongly positive. And when you focus on your opponent, you want to focus on the negative consequences of them or their policies to your audience. So you may be wanting to highlight the fact that they've taken some extreme positions in the past which make them a risk, or that when they've been in charge in the past, taxes have gone up or buses have never run on time or whatever it is. And it's fair, you know, it's fair enough that you point to that. You've got to focus on your opponent as well as yourself. When you're an incumbent seeking re-election, you need both a record that you remind people of, things that you've done, but also an agenda. People will never vote for you. If you're an incumbent, you've been in for 4 or 5 years or whatever it is, they're not going to vote to thank you. You know, no one runs down the street and hugs an MP particularly tightly. Well, sometimes they hug them around the neck, but they don't hug them and thank them for what they've done. But nevertheless, you need to have an agenda. One of the challenges that we found, and Boris Johnson found, when he was running for re-election was early on, not everybody could recall or knew all that he'd done. So the first thing that we needed to do was remind people of his achievements. That's the record. But that's not enough. You need to have an agenda, a plan of some basic clear things that you want to do if you're elected, that you want to implement if you're elected. If you're an incumbent and only focus on your future agenda and don't remind people of your record, or you don't have a record, you're less likely to win. Because people say, well, what you're saying now that you're going to do is great, except what did you do the first 4 years you were in? Why should I vote for you now? If you didn't do it then, why should I believe you're going to do it now? So for an incumbent, you need a record as well as an agenda. If you're a candidate seeking to knock off an incumbent, you need a record, but it's a different sort of record. It's not about what you've done in the job. It's about other things you've done in the past that make you well suited to the job you seek. Now, I mentioned before that I don't think people vote for policies. I don't. I generally don't think people vote for a particular policy. I don't think many people go into a polling booth saying, oh, I really like that policy, I'm going to vote for it. But they do vote for what policies say about a candidate or a party and their values and their beliefs, and whether the candidate or the party are in touch with what matters to you and can relate to the life you lead or the hopes that you have for your life. So you need to have a good set of policies. in the key areas that matter to people, that say something about what you believe in, that show that you recognise the challenges that people face. I mean, to be fair to Ken Livingstone, and I'm not very often, but to be fair to Ken Livingstone, his policy about cutting bus and train fares was a recognition that for some people that it was costing more and more, and it was an important impact on their cost of living. So he was trying to do something about their cost of living. So that's what that policy said. You know, I understand you're hurting, I'm going to do something about it, and so forth. In addition to policies, though, there are also political issues, and there's a sort of four-part test that I always apply to an issue to work out whether it's going to be a political issue that we should involve ourselves with from a campaign viewpoint. Now, I'm not talking about government here. Governments have to do lots of things. They have an obligation to operate in many areas that you don't talk about in a campaign. You don't want to talk about in a campaign, or you don't need to talk about in a campaign. But they have an obligation because they're representing the whole community, not just people who voted for them, but the people who didn't vote for them as well, and likely never going to vote for them. When you're running a campaign, you have a particular objective, and that is, you know, to get your side over the line, to help them win in the right way. Not breaking the law, consistent with your values and all of those things. And there are really four elements to political issues that I look at political issues and to satisfy four tests to work out whether they're relevant for us in a campaign context. The first is an issue generally salient? That is it out there and sort of makes sense to people that you're talking about it? Secondly, is it personally relevant? If it's not generally salient and you start talking about it, people think, what on earth is, you know, where's he or she coming from? What are they talking about? You know, there's no connection whatsoever. So it needs to be that general salience, but then you need to have personal relevance. People need to see how it relates to them and their lives, or relates to something that's important to them. They're the first two tests. The third test is it's got to be capable of being politically differentiated. If you can't, you've got to set yourself apart from your opponent. Otherwise, why would people, if they voted for them last time and you're offering the same, there's no political differentiation, why would they change to you? So there's got to be political differentiation. And then finally, the issues that you pursue have to be capable of point of sale execution. What I mean by that is they have to relate to how people behave in a polling place. And people have to know the connection. They have to know, oh, right, I'm going in to vote. When I vote, I'm doing this because this is the consequence of me doing this, which is, you know, a positive consequence in some way. There's lots of things in a campaign, lots of tools you employ. I mentioned before about, you know, mechanics versus message. And sometimes, and I think it came in a question last time, Harris, you know, somebody asked me about the internet and new media and all of that, and Obama. And, you know, the new media is a very important tool to carry a message. It's used more in the States, but probably more useful in the UK, because in the UK you have a cap on spending and new media is cheap. You know, using the internet is a low-cost way to carry a message. Whereas in the States, they spend literally billions on campaigns. And have television and advertising, all sorts of things. Yeah, thanks, mate, that'd be great. And in fact, I don't know if any of you have heard of Joe Trippi. He wrote a book called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, which is about the use of the internet. And in that little office there is one of his people who works with us. We do a lot of new media work. He's a Democrat and very well known. He ran Howard Dean's campaign. And at that time used the internet to raise more money than ever been raised in a political campaign. Ever before in political history. And as I say, people often ask about Obama and the internet and all of that. The American presidential campaign, they spent $2.5 billion, roughly, the two top candidates. And whilst it is true Obama did a lot with the internet, and used digital media to connect with people, he still spent about 600 million on television. The reason the internet featured so prominently, particularly in his first campaign, was that it was a classic case of the message, of the vehicle being the message. Because his first election was about empowerment, speaking out to young people who'd been less involved in the political process, to people in the black community who'd been less involved in the political process, and said to them, you can have a say, you can make a difference, yes we can, and all of that. Now, digital media, the internet, tweeting, all the things I'm not very good at, they of themselves reflected that message, because using your mobile phone you can be empowered to participate in the election. Using the internet you could have a say. So the organising tool was actually the message. The organising tool was a tool of empowerment. You've seen it in some countries in the Middle East and elsewhere, how people have been able to unleash themselves from constraint by the use of digital media and so forth. And that's why I think it was particularly relevant in his first campaign, because the vehicle was also the message. That's not always the case, but that's why I think it played such an important part.
So thanks, Lynton, that was great. So my question is about the extent to which you differentiate and you tailor your messages according to different audiences. So I think in some communication circles there's something around audience segmentation, and the way you make decisions about what the trade-offs are between focusing on a particular group maybe, so you talked about in Australia, Italians and Greeks, and what the ramifications might be in doing that for, say, let's quote, mainstream unquote audiences, and how do you make those calls, and what the pros and the cons are when you do that kind of thing?
Well, the first thing is, when you communicate, you shouldn't say one thing to one group and a completely different thing to another group. I mean, what you say has to be consistent. And, it used to be the case, frankly, that, 40 or 50 years ago, a politician in Australia, we've got some huge electorates, a politician could go to one part of it, and I mean huge, like we've got electorates that are many times bigger than the entire United Kingdom, and have sort of 50 people, a cat and a dog in it. People could go to the north and say, a politician could say one thing that you wanted to hear, yes, you deserve that road, and go down south and say something completely opposite, yeah, you deserve this, and never get caught out. These days, with such an intensity of media, so many vehicles through which people's views and can be communicated and things can be recorded, it's wrong anyway, but two, you can't get away with it. But there is a place, there are two sort of elements to communication, I think. There are narrowcast messages and there are broadcast messages. So in any campaign, you'll generally have a range of broadcast messages that are designed to appeal to the community at its largest. So, a message about, we believe in lower tax, for example. Now, that sort of sets up your overall proposition. But then there'll be particular groups, and it can be, you can segment in any way. So, for example, when you're talking to small business people, you'll focus very much on some of the issues that are important to them. But it won't be at odds with that broader message. And so effectively what you're trying to do is narrowcast sort of more fine-tuned and resonant messages to particular groups that are relevant to the outcome, whilst having an overall narrative as well. And often what you try to do is you have a generalised theme for the campaign, and then use local examples or sector-specific or segment-specific or demographic-specific examples to reinforce that overall theme. That's what you try to do. And you've got this other challenge where you have voluntary voting that, whereas in Australia with compulsory voting, everybody's going to vote, so you've got to work out how you can get a better vote than your opponent. people in this country also have the choice of not voting, and so you spend more of your resources and effort not just persuading people, you do that first, but also motivating them to turn out. Because if your own people sit on their hands, or groups who do like what they hear but aren't going to vote, they don't turn out to vote, well, it's sort of been interesting but pointless. And that's always, so turnout becomes a big challenge. One of the good things about this country, and there are many, but one of the good things about this country, I think, relative to, say, the United States, is that even though you have voluntary voting here, just as they have in the US, voluntary voting has meant, and a declining turnout, has meant that the influence of special interest groups, whether it's, pro-gun or pro-abortion or anti-abortion or, whatever it is much reduced in this country. For some reason, it's much reduced in this country compared to the States. And that's, I think, one of the dangers of the American system is increasingly candidates are influenced by, if someone can turn up and say, I've got 5 million names on my database and we'll come out in support of you if you take this position, that does lead to the impact of special interests and also polarisation. Do you know, when George Bush, the second George Bush, was first elected president, Worthland Worldwide, Richard Worthland's firm, did a poll of what people said was the most important issue in deciding their vote, in turning out to vote for George Bush. What was the issue? Number one issue, the reason people gave for voting for George Bush, his position on abortion, 26% of people. The number one reason that people gave for voting for Al Gore was the fact that he was a Democrat, so it was just party affiliation. The number two position was his position on abortion. So you had this polarisation on issues that don't, whilst they're important issues and people have views about them, they aren't the sort of emotional drivers for votes in this country as they are in the US. And I think the US suffers as a consequence of it, because you get this intense polarisation around emotive issues, and people use emotive issues to drive their people out to vote. Fortunately, that's not been, to date at least, the situation in the UK. It's even less in Australia because everyone votes, so you get the great unwashed, if I can describe them that way, the great middle ground, and the disinterested, and all of those get their say as well. So they're turning out to vote. You can't just try to polarise a group and motivate them out to vote.
Again, with your four-part thing, I think the third point was to have a clear message and make it clear.
Differentiation, yeah.
Basically, One Nation, Labour is the big society. So how are you going to differentiate between that? And do you think the big society, passionate conservatism has been taken over?
Yeah, right. The answer is no, but I'll come back to that. Very good question. They're all good questions. The first question is an interesting and important one. The first thing is, as I said, there's a distinction between campaigning and governing. When you're elected, you have an obligation to govern for all in the community. You have a responsibility to do that. Now, you'll always do things that somebody doesn't like, because that's like, if in doubt, sit on your hands. You've got to make decisions. You have to do the right thing, and that, in your terms, the right thing to do, and that can have costs. So Boris himself was always of the view that he needed to reach out to all Londoners. And if you saw, when he became mayor in 2008, he set up the Mayor's Fund for London. That was very geared to young, black, basically Afro-Caribbean lads, teenagers, who been involved in gangs and things, and had, some might say, lost their way. And so he'd always done a lot, or was committed to trying to do more to improve their lives and to get them into society in the right way. So, and that was something he genuinely believes in and believed in. It wasn't a case of saying, well, London's got more people are probably non-white British born than white British born, was something that he saw was very important. There's a lot of, there are two things that I've long ago learnt to disregard. Sometimes it's been about me, in the media, things people say, but generally there are no truisms in politics, yet the media always try to perpetuate truisms. And generally the caricatures that are portrayed in the media, sometimes in the community more generally, are wrong. There's a lot of caricaturing that goes on that's just rubbish. We did a lot of work, but we didn't talk about it in a campaign sense, in targeting different communities and areas. Now remember, what the job in the mayoral election is quite different to a general election. In the mayoral election, you've got to win the popular vote. And a vote in Tower Hamlets for Boris Johnson is as important and as valuable as a vote in Chelsea for him. Conversely, a vote in Lowndes Square is important and valuable to Ken Livingstone as a vote in Newham. So it's not, what we had to do was identify where we could get enough votes to win, to have more votes than Livingstone, because we're not trying to win seats. See, in a general election, the Labor Party's going to do very little in Newham or Tower Hamlets, because it doesn't have to. But that doesn't apply in a mayoral election. So you had to campaign differently. You had to try to get votes from all sorts of areas that you may not normally get support from. And one of Boris's qualities is that whilst he is, everyone knows him to be a conservative, he is a bit of a maverick, a bit of a character, and is able to draw people from across the political spectrum. So in every demographic and every ethnic background, Boris outperformed relative to the Conservative Party. And so, it's true that Ken Livingstone got much greater support in the Muslim community than Boris did, but Boris got a lot more support than the Conservative Party has traditionally got, in London at least. We tried to reach out to Londoners wherever we could find. People don't care about your background. You can't deny, you are who you are, right? And you should always, you are who you are. It's important that you believe in something. If in doubt, stand for something. This is sort of my motto of politics. It's not who you are. It should not be who you are that is the basis on which people vote, or not where you've come from. It's what your commitment is to better people's lives. And it doesn't matter whether you've come from a very wealthy background or a very poor background, and you're a candidate. If you demonstrate that you understand the voting community's needs, and you have a plan to deal with them, then that's the most important thing. Where it's a problem is if people think, because you've got this background, well, I haven't heard you talk about any of the things that matter to me. You've got a privileged background. Therefore, because you're privileged, you don't understand. But I asked this question of Bloomberg. Funnily enough, there was a private dinner here. He was over last year, and I said to him, "How did you deal with the fact that you're very, very wealthy? Was that an issue for voters?" And interestingly, he said two things. He said they researched it heavily to see how voters would react to the fact that he was rich. Firstly, having wealth was okay as long as you didn't inherit it. In other words, he got it by working hard himself and setting up a business and being successful. So he said that was important. And the second was, and maybe this is more American than British, but good on you for having a go and being successful. And actually the third thing was, he focused on issues that mattered to people. They didn't mind the fact that he was rich if he was trying to make traffic flow better or implement better schools in various districts across New York or whatever it might be. And then your question, which was a follow-up, was about Big Society and One Nation. Well, and differentiation. Well, the risk, firstly, if anyone can, in 10 words or less, explain to me what One Nation is, I'll be interested to know. Two, because I don't think the average punter, like those of us in politics, will have a view about what One Nation anything is, but average punters, you know, they don't talk about, walk down there and talk to the guy waiting at the bus stop. What do you think about a One Nation political party? They'd say, what on earth are you talking about? So I don't think, you know, I don't think One Nation means anything to most voters. Sometimes, speaking against myself in a way, I suppose, sometimes if you're a political party and you've got a particular, this is often the case for oppositions, if you've got a particular problem, something negative about you, you actually don't want, you're trying to avoid differentiation from your opponent. So take, for example, what was one of the big hesitations against Labor in this country for many years? They couldn't manage money, you know, like in the end you couldn't trust them with the economy. So Labor's strategy was not to differentiate themselves, and basically the Tories, whatever you thought of them, they knew how to manage money. A lot of them seemed to have it. So when in that situation, what you're actually trying to do is minimise point of differences. So actually, they both know how to handle money. You know, I'm pretty comfortable. Both will do a reasonable job with the economy. So we'll move on to other territory on which to vote, on which to make a decision about how we vote. And you think about it, Tony Blair basically wanted to neutralise on the economy. So Gordon Brown had the golden rule and all this, remember that? So that they were actually trying to establish Labor's credentials on the economy and minimise points of differentiation, right, on things where they were weak. But then they went to establish points of differentiation on issues where they had a point, you know, they were stronger than the Conservatives, like health or education. Education. You know, so that there's, you know, there's always an exception to a general rule, but so overall they established differentiation on their terms. The differentiation was on education and health, and the policies they took to the election on that, and they sought to minimise differentiation on an area where they were weak, the economy. They wanted to neutralise on the economy, so that the Tories couldn't do in 1997 what they did in 1992, which basically, in the end, establish Labor as a big risk for the economy and make people think, oh, step too far, we can't trust them with the economy.
Does anyone know how much Bloomberg gets paid a year, apart from Lynton? No one? Guess.
£200,000 a year.
$1 a year. He doesn't accept your salary, he returns it, which is also quite. It's about, again, connecting with those emotional aspects of somebody.
Yeah, he wasn't doing it for the money. You know, he's doing it because he believes in it.
You mentioned when you talked about the London mayoral election that voters also looked at personal qualities and traits within the candidates. And what are these, like, specifically, and how are these sort of demonstrated throughout their campaigns?
Yeah, well, they're not. I mean, there's lots of different elements, and at different times they can be. Sometimes, you know, one will come into play, another. So there are things like trust, likability, honesty, competence, being in touch, strength. Now, sometimes, and strength can be sort of compassionate and, you know, sort of a strength in terms of a quiet determination or an ability to relate. That could be a strength in one political landscape. In another, it could be, you know, real the sort of traditional strength, like tough and so forth. For example, if you're faced with very, you know, think of Churchill in the war, you wouldn't have said he was. He was, they describe, the bulldog, the tough, determined, stubborn, all of those qualities. Now, in a lot of climates, being a stubborn, very focused, completely driven to your agenda and nobody else's could be a negative. But in the war, it was a resolute determination that helped the country get through. So at different times, different qualities can be important. If the economy's going very well, things are on track and the economy's going very well, a sort of more in touch, compassionate style of candidate could well be what people want. When the economy's very difficult and you're in debt, people know that you might have to make some difficult decisions. The sort of person you want to make those difficult decisions could be quite different, and the qualities they have could be quite different. So if you think about a company like HMV, pick a random example, that is in trouble, they won't necessarily want somebody who's going to come in and sort of link arms with all the staff and shareholders and sing Kumbaya and make them all feel good about themselves. They might just want somebody who can come in and cut costs and sort of lance the boil, and I'm mixing a lot of metaphors here, and get the business back on track. There's a guy in the States called Al Dunlap, who was Chainsaw Al, they used to call him, and he had a record of turning around some companies that were, he was very arrogant. I think he's passed away, so God rest his soul, but very arrogant, very tough, all of those things. No one liked him. He didn't, Boris was always strong on the likability measure. He didn't satisfy any of those tests, but when your company was about to die, he was the one you wanted to come and help save it. He was put in charge of a company in Australia, a media company, and he was an absolute disaster because it was at a different stage, and so you didn't want tough, arrogant, not listen to anybody else, just absolutely determined to get to an end. You wanted somebody who was, could build a team, make people feel good about themselves, be inclusive, and all of that.